Today we're going to be discussing a topic that I feel like has not really been checked ever since we discussed it before, which is the best faction in Call of Dragons, especially for later on in the game, way past the early game. Is it the Springwardens, is it the League of Order, or is it the Wilderburg? Stick around in this video because we're going to be answering this question and breaking down why the best faction is currently the best as it is. What is up, guys? MEOWER here, back with a brand new Call of Dragons video. So, today's video we're gonna be breaking down which is the best faction in Call of Dragons in both the early game and after you unlock T4. Before we get started, be sure to drop a like, subscribe so you don't miss out on any new videos, and join our Discord. In the link is in the description below. I would love to interact with each and every one of you, and especially here if you have video ideas or such that you would love to see implemented. That being said, let's get started. We're going to be structuring this video based on the following. We're going to be structuring which is the best starting faction, and then which you should switch to later on as soon as you unlock T4. So we're going to be discussing pre T4 and past T4 because T4 is like the pretty much the staple of the game, the mid game, the game itself, basically. Anything higher than T4 is, of course, is most welcome. Anything lower than T4, you should not be really wasting any time sticking to that. You should be rushing T4 as fast as possible. That being said, of course, these are based on my opinion. Others' opinion might differ than mine. This is just based on my opinion and my experience playing Call of Dragons so far for the past months, almost a year now, like whatever. That being said, let's get started. So the best starting faction, in my opinion, in Call of Dragons is the Springwarden, which is mainly for Guanwin. Now, hear me out on this. I know most of the time you would hear League of Order, Gathering Speed, etc., etc., etc. But in my opinion, the Spring Warden is actually better in the early game, mainly for a few reasons. One, their troops are pretty mobile early on, so you're gonna have some extra march speed, so you can run around the map, farm your Darklings faster, heal your troops slightly faster with the elixir production speed, and of course you're going to have access to Guanwin at the get-go. Guanwin is going to carry you early on because she's not only is she amazing for farming Darklings and fortresses, she's also super good for behemoths because archers, of course, do the best DPS in behemoth fights. Their troops are pretty meh. Work elks do have faster march speed, so they can help you go in and go out from resource nodes faster. Elk riders are pretty nimble. Eagles are pretty meh. They're not that really that good, to be honest with you. Longleaf trains are decent. The Ironbark's infantry are the same across all three factions, and of course the archers are pretty decent. They have slightly less attack, or slightly less march speed in exchange for more physical attack. So overall, they're pretty nice. Overall, a very well-rounded faction. They're not necessarily good or not necessarily bad. They're just really good for starting in the early game, and they can help you really well. Later on, you can switch to the League of Order at like City Hall 10 if you want to start working on your Voltier. However, I would recommend you save your faction switching early on, and you should not really be touching the Wilderburg in the early game, and mainly because their troops really start to shine in later tiers. And of course, I'll break down why that is and why work rhinos are pretty OP as well. That being said, for the early game, I personally would recommend the Spring Wardens till you reach T4. After T4, I would recommend you swap to the best faction in Call of Dragons by far. Nothing comes close from their troops. Their faction bonus is pretty meh, but their troops are basically what carries that faction. So, that being said, for the early game, Spring Wardens, pretty nice, pretty solid overall. They're going to help you, they're going to carry you early on. And then we're going to be starting to discuss the mid game when you start unlocking your first T4s and when you should swap to the other faction. So you've unlocked your T4s. Now you basically really starting the game, and now it is important to know what really makes the best faction the best faction. First of all, we're going to be comparing all troops um, um, of every single faction. We're going to be comparing their buffs, and of course, we're going to be comparing what makes them really good and what the outliner really is. That being said, let's get started. We're gonna start off with the Springwarden troops, and we're gonna break down what makes them good, what the good, the bad is, and then we're gonna start with the League of Order, what the good, the bad is, and finally Wilderburg, what the good, the bad is, and finally I'll give you my thoughts on what the best faction really is and why that is the case. So, the Spring Wardens have a buff that provides Legion March Speed, Elixir Production Speed, pretty decent buffs overall. Nothing too game breaking, nothing too OP, nothing too bad. It's just some really solid buffs overall. Of course, every single troop type loves March Speed, and you can never go wrong with Elixir Production Speed. However, what makes the Spring Wardens pretty bad later on in the game, though, is the troop they have. The troops they have are pretty lackluster in terms of their skills. You got archers that are slightly slower. They have a slightly more attack, but they are not that good. While the Ironbark Treants are just the basic infantry, all three factions have the same infantry, so I'm not going to be discussing any infantry at all. The mages of the Spring Wardens provide a defense stat for others, which is around 20% for one other legion. Though defense on mages is basically the worst stat you can possibly have. On mages, you want either HP or you want attack. You don't want defense at all because they already have extremely low defenses anyway. So it's kind of a waste to have any defenses on them, if that makes sense. Its gathering units um, only have slightly faster march speed when when moving towards resource points. Pretty lame buff overall. Definitely the worst gathering units in the game. And of course, they're elk riders. Now, elk riders are pretty interesting troop because they are cavalry and at the same time they are ranged. So they have the ability to fully apply 100% counterattack damage, but they in exchange to that they lose the buff, which is the the charge attack buff, which now cavalry have, where they increase march speed when attacking a target legion, especially if they are a ranged legion. They gain 1,000 rage immediately, so they can immediately cast their rage skill the moment they enter combat, which makes them pretty solid and pretty strong overall. That applies for eagles, that applies for knights, and that applies for Wolf Riders of the Wilderburg. So that is why, in my opinion, elk riders are only viable for raiding, but nothing else really. I don't think they're that good for open scale PvP combat. If you want to run a raid, the reason why you run a cavalry march is to flank people and charge and intercept the retreating marches or the reinforcing range marches. So this does not really intercept at all. So kind of already loses the benefit of having a charge attack on cavalry. And finally, Eagles. The flying units of the Spring Warden are pretty lackluster overall. Eagles have worse stats than any other cavalry type. The only advantage they have is flying, but flying is not really a good enough offset to lose that much attack. To lose that much attack. Plus, you can always just use the blink artifact in order to bypass terrain. So all in all, in my opinion, later on in the game, the Spring Wardens are a pretty meh faction. I would rate them currently as the third place faction later on. They just lose way too much value in comparison to others. Next up, the League of Order. Oops. Oh yeah, the League of Order is was usually considered the best faction, but I don't think they will be anymore after this video, and I'll explain why. Starting which, their mages are pretty strong overall. They have an HP buff on Vestals, which is pretty good, and Celestials are the strongest mage type in the game with slightly higher attack base stat, and of course they gain extra attack when standing still and attacking. Every 4 seconds they gain 10% attack. Pretty solid overall, like the best mage faction by far, the best mage units. However, its swordsmen are pretty, again, I'm not going to discuss swordsmen. The archers are the worst type of archers in the game. They're pretty slow, they're not really that strong, and their buff is pretty lackluster. And the cavalry, while yes, they have a good overall all-rounded stat, they're not really that strong in comparison to the Wilderburg cavalry. And I'll explain why when I get to the Wilderburg troops. And of course, they have an overall gather speed, but that overall gather speed 10% is not as significant as you actually might think, because 10% gather speed, according to my good friend Hellrider, is around 5 minutes worth of gathering time, which is not really that significant when we break down the work rhinos of the Wilderburg, which provide an extra 5% when you gather from a node. So I'll explain why mathematically when we reach the Wilderburg. And of course, they have workhorses that have higher load capacity, but load capacity is not really that significant, except for like the first 10 20 days of the server, and then afterwards when when your tech starts kicking in, when your levels of of your commander start kicking in, everything load capacity just becomes less valuable over time. So while yes, Wilderburg really the League of Order really specialize in mages, I will rank them the second best faction in the game. Now, for the best faction in the game, the Wilderburg. Wilderburg, in my opinion, is extremely strong for a few reasons. First of all, they have Legion physical attack, which benefits three troop types that they have, while Springwardens don't really have any direct buffs, and League of Order only has overall magic defense, which only slightly benefits the swordsman. It doesn't really benefit anything else. So physical attack already benefits everything. The destruction engineering, while 10% is not really anything at all, it's just decent if you're just destroying barricades solo. But while yes, it is useless, the same can be argued for the overall gather speed, the extra 5 minutes, and I'll explain why that is. Of course, Springwardens have the best overall buffs on their faction, but they don't have the best troops, while the Wilderburg actually do have the best troops. And here's why. Axemen are pretty basic infantry. Spearmen. Spearmen are the best archers in the game because they have an all 5% all damage dealt, which constitutes to skill damage, constitutes to counterattack, and constitutes to regular attack. So you're getting already a flat 5% damage buff on every single action you do, which is pretty significantly big when you calculate how long it takes for a fight for archers to fight and such. The counterattack is so much valuable, etc., etc., etc. Second of all, while the mages provide an attack buff, 20% attack is pretty valuable for mages because mages you already are extremely safe if you're positioning correctly, and you should just be a pure glass cannon build. So having extra 20% attack benefits you so much more than having slightly more HP or slightly more defense. Next up, it's cavalry. Cavalry have their cavalry wolf riders have a really interesting buff. Well, they they put 5% extra troops from your legion and the enemy's legion into the hospital. In my opinion, this is extremely OP, mainly for a few reasons. If you're using cavalry correctly, you're not gonna feel that 5% on your legion because you should mainly be attacking either archer marchers or mage marchers, which will not really be putting up any significant resistance on your cavalry march, so you're not really going to be taking any damage at all, while you're putting 5% more troops in their hospital, which over time it kind of adds up. And it doesn't seem to be that big, but over time it just really adds up a lot. In return, they end up losing way more than you lose because if you're using cavalry correctly, you should not really be taking that much damage to begin with. Finally, their flying unit are pretty meh. I would say it's probably one of the worst flying units in the game, or just up there with Eagles, because, well, their skills are pretty worthless right now because there's just no commander that can benefit from them so far. Maybe when they add when more commanders are added that can make use of the HP buff and the skill damage, then the Wyvern Runners can be considered good, but till then they're pretty subpar. I would even argue them to not be used at all unless you're just going to use them on a pure flying march. And then finally, the Work Rhinos. Now, Work Rhinos, in my opinion, or not in my opinion, mathematically wise, based on the math Hellrider has provided me so graciously, they are actually more valuable than the 10% flat bonus from League of Order. If you don't know, work runners provide 5% extra resources when you are gathering from a node, so you're basically getting 5% of any node you're gathering. Mathematically wise, if we're gonna base it off a 1 million resource node, and you're basically going to have the same gather speed with the exception of an extra 10%. So we're going to calculate based on 250% versus 240%, what you're going to have with the Wilderburg. If you are just an average player, you don't have that much buffs and anything, you're only going to be missing out on 5 minutes of gathering versus having a 58% bonus from work rhinos overall, because you're going to be netting more resources overall versus just a 5 minute loss, or even slightly more, 5 minutes give or take. So you're going to sacrifice 5 extra minutes of gathering for getting 58% more resources for that 5 minute duration. So we're basing this off the buff comparison to the League of Orders gather speed. So overall, work rhinos actually do provide you with more resources in the long term in comparison to League of Order. Now you might be wondering, but MEOWER, I don't really get trained that many work rhinos to begin with. Well, if you are pacing you're pacing yourself properly, you should be training work rhinos all the way till you unlock eventually T4 cavalry, because then T4 cavalry are actually useful, while while T2 and T3 cavalry are absolutely worthless. So you should just be training purely work runners all the way till you reach something like 150 to 200k, which will also in turn help you with your hospital capacity, because the more troops you have and more legions you have, the more hospital amounts you can heal per day. So all in all, there is no downside, but of course do keep in mind this added bonus only applies for when you are gathering with the work rhinos. So be sure to use work rhinos when you're gathering in order to offset that 10% loss from League of Orders. So in summary, later on in the game, switch to Wilderburg. It's the best faction overall. The 3% Legion physical attack benefits your archers, it benefits your Wyvern Riders, it benefits your cavalry. It does not really benefit your mages at all, but in turn, you're getting 20% attack anyways, so you're getting just that much more value on your mages. Wilderburg is super strong right now, unless they end up nerfing their units, which I don't think will happen, or they release a stronger faction. I would say just switch to Wilderburg. You will not regret it. It is worth the investment. I've switched and I haven't looked back since. I highly recommend you do the same. If you like videos like this, please be sure to drop a like. Don't forget to subscribe. Join our Discord to discuss with us if you have a different opinion than the things I have presented to you. And of course, I will see you in the next video. Meow meow.